All right, good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today for the COVID vaccine and employment law, HR policy implications. I'm Jackie Petroselli, the marketing specialist here at MP. For those of you joining us on a webinar for the first time, MP is a full-service human capital management services company offering a suite of products and services, including HR, payroll, benefits administration, time and attendance, and compliance. We support our clients with cutting-edge technical solutions, as well as proactive, reliable service and deep HR and payroll expertise. MP is wired for HR and helps clients succeed by tying their operations to their business goals. Today, we're partnering with Verrill Law Firm on this webinar. Verrill's deeply rooted history dates back to 1862. Today, Verrill is a full-service law firm with 120 attorneys and 7 offices throughout the Northeast. The firm's attorneys provide award-winning client services to businesses and individuals around the globe. Their clients are in a variety of industries, including construction, energy, estate planning, fiduciary services, food and beverage, healthcare, higher education, manufacturing, technology, and telecommunications, among others. For more information about the firm and its values, visit www.verrill-law.com. Our presenter today is Tani Alvarez. Tani Alvarez is a partner in Verrill's Employment and Labor Practice Group. She centers her practice on the understanding that the employment landscape is ever-changing and that organizations do not have the time or resources to keep abreast of all the changes. Tani has represented diverse clients in a broad range of industries, from small family-owned businesses to nonprofits to Fortune 100 companies across the country. And with that, I'll hand the mic off to Tani.
Thank you so much, Jackie, and thank you to everyone who is on today's webinar. Jackie, let's get right into it with that first slide. Now, as Jackie mentioned, my name is Tani Alvarez. My practice is centered in labor and employment practices. This is very broad, and it's important for employers to understand that when I'm talking about today's topic, a number of things. One, I'm not in the medical industry or a scientist. All of the information that I have concerning the vaccine that I am relying upon is specifically from the CDC. So while there might be information that is contrary to some of the things that I might be saying during the course of this presentation, or you may have read studies or news articles that may be different, I'm relying specifically on CDC guidance. And just so that we're on the same page, this is that although the COVID-19 vaccines have been found to be effective at keeping individuals from getting sick, scientists are still learning how well vaccines can prevent individuals from spreading the virus that causes COVID-19 to others, even if a person who's been vaccinated does not get sick. So it's with that standard generally that I'm using that scientific data to move forward and talk about the legal risks and implications that companies are going to face. All of this data and information is going to be based primarily on federal law. However, employers need to be mindful of state law provisions and guidance in the states in which they operate or have employees. And there's going to be specific times in which I reference that, but employers need to be mindful that both federal and state laws are going to be applicable. Additionally, it's always important for me to make sure that participants and listeners all know what they're going to get by the end of this presentation, in part because I don't like to disappoint. If anyone's listening thinking that they're going to come away with me providing answers on exactly how they should move forward or what their COVID immunization or vaccine policy should be, I'm going to tell you right now that unfortunately I can't provide that answer. But what I can provide you with is a whole host of risks that need to be taken into account as you and your leadership move forward in deciding how to respond to, create, and implement policies related to the vaccine and COVID more generally within your workforce. So specifically, as we talk about that very large scale discussion about policies and practices, We're going to talk about the effect that having a mandatory vaccine policy could have on hiring and firing generally within your organization. We're going to talk about if you have a mandatory vaccine policy, the effect that it could have with regards to unionization efforts within your organization, or if you already are unionized workforces, other hurdles that you may need to cross in order to maintain or create a mandatory immunization policy as it relates to the COVID vaccine. We're going to talk about vaccine incentives, whether there's a risk, what that risk is, and how to move forward. We're going to talk about workers' compensation and whether it potentially will cover vaccine-related side effects. And that's going to depend on a number of factors that we're going to talk about in more detail. We're then going to talk about if you have a mandatory policy, could an employee opt out of vaccinations based off of political beliefs? We're going to talk about the EEOC and the vaccine and how to respond if an employee indicates that for religious or disability related reasons that they need an accommodation to not follow any mandatory vaccine policy. And then we're also going to talk about how you move forward. Many of you likely have individuals who are already within your workforce who have become vaccinated. And the question of whether or not policy should be amended for the vaccinated. Jackie, let's jump to the next slide. So the first question is this hiring and firing question. And I'm going to give you 2 slides regarding this topic, in part because the data is quickly evolving and changing, and depending on where you get the information from, the data changes. We've seen multiple public entities and organizations who have been throwing around data and research concerning the percentage of the population that is indicating that they will receive a vaccination or they feel comfortable receiving a vaccination. So let's talk about what that looks like. So this data on this slide is from February 9th. And this is all based off of Facebook data, and it shows states in which individuals have indicated that they would get vaccinated. So you're looking at generally across the United States, between 15% and 35% of the population is indicating that they would refuse vaccinations. This is important because in determining if your organization is going to mandate vaccines to be received with regards to COVID-19, it's going to diminish your labor pool and likely take out of the running individuals who are indicating that they won't be vaccinated. This is even without regard to all the legal implications of a mandatory vaccine pool. Let's just talk about how many open positions do you have currently? Will that increase or decrease? There's been discussion about the fact that in some situations, mandating the vaccine is used as a good way to promote or retain individuals by talking about how highly the organization prioritizes employee safety. But if the individual is one of this 15 to 35% of individuals who would refuse to or don't want to get vaccinated, you've kind of closed off the pipeline for those individuals to enter your organization. Now, we're going to talk later in the program about all the exceptions, even if you mandate having the vaccine. But for right now, let's just talk about your hiring pool or the percentage of people you would have to let go if they refused to become vaccinated without regard to the reason behind why they were refusing vaccination. Let's jump to the next slide, Jackie. So first slide is Facebook data, and everyone's like, didn't anyone teach you, Tani, that you can't use Wikipedia as a source? Isn't Facebook very similar? So now let's talk about Census Bureau data. So we've got Census Bureau data here that shows a multitude of different major and metropolitan areas, and this is the percentage of individuals who indicated based off of a Census Bureau survey that was conducted between February 3rd and February 15th of individuals who are 18 years of age or older who indicated that they would probably and definitely not receive a COVID-19 vaccine. And you'll see this data is fairly similar to that in which we are seeing in the Facebook trends. It's a little bit lower, between 10% of individuals and 28% of individuals. But this is important when you're looking at your labor pool, and if you currently have open positions, if you were to mandate a vaccine, would it increase the number of open positions that you have or decrease it? Let's go to the next slide, Jackie. So now let's talk about the implications more generally of a mandatory vaccination policy. And there's three big aspects of this that we're then going to jump into and talk about more throughout the course of the presentation. But the first one is pre-screening issues. So if you're going to mandate having vaccines of your employees, you're going to have questions about, are we going to provide those vaccines? There then becomes a question of whether or not your organization has access to it. If you're a healthcare provider, that might be easier, but if you're not a healthcare provider, more difficult. Are you going to have the immunization occur on site, as many people do with flu vaccines, or would it be provided by a third party, or would you simply have employees go to more publicly available centers such as Walgreens or other pharmacies? Now, if you were to mandate having either having it within your organization, sponsoring a clinic, and it was something that your employees did, pre-screening questions are likely going to lead to receipt of private medical information. And that could be then considered a medical screening under the Americans with Disabilities Act and open up the individual to exposure under the ADA and similar state laws. So those pre-screening questions, if you're going to go through that process, you must prove that then by mandating it and by having the clinic on site or an employer-sponsored mandatory vaccination, that the questions you're asking in that pre-screening are job related and a business necessity, because it's going to elicit potentially disability related information. So this means that from a practical standpoint, employers have to show that if an employee does not answer the questions and therefore refuses to receive the vaccination, that that individual will pose a direct threat to themselves or others. Now, this becomes a case-by-case analysis because we have to assess the actual threat level within the workplace. Now, this is only if we're mandating the vaccine, right? If it's voluntary and people can do it whether they want to or not, and we don't participate in the process, then of course we're not going to be involved in those pre-screening questions. But if you're mandating it, you have to show that the employee is going to pose a direct threat to themselves or to others. Now, when we make that direct threat analysis, this is something that most of you have already heard. Now that we're 12 months into this pandemic, we're going to analyze 4 different factors, and that's determining whether or not a direct threat exists, the duration of the risk, the nature and severity of the potential harm, the likelihood that the potential harm will occur, and the imminence of the potential harm. And all of those have been set forth by the EEOC and are available on the EEOC's pandemic response page. So that is your first thing, is the pre-screening issues if you're mandating it, right? Because you're likely going to get health-related information that's going to lead to questions regarding any potential disability or other health conditions. The next aspect of it is making sure that there's very clear communications that are sent out. Are you communicating with employees that you're mandating the vaccine for all employees? Are you only mandating it for a specific segment of your workforce? If it's only for a specific segment of your workforce, why is that? Are you in a position in which your current operations are insignificantly safe for employees who are currently operating in that environment? And in part, that's because going back to the CDC and the information that we have regarding currently unknown information as to whether or not an immunized person can still spread COVID. The question becomes is what's the difference between someone being immunized or maintaining social distancing, masking, and enhancing all the cleaning requirements that previously were put in place during the course of the pandemic? Is the spread minimized in any way by somebody being vaccinated? That question has not been answered. There's also going to be kind of general policy implications. So you're going to have to review your current expectations, your current job descriptions, all of that information in determining kind of whether or not to mandate the vaccination, and if so, who to mandate it with. Now, I'm generally discussing this as it relates to private employers. For public employers, it becomes an even more difficult question. And that's because in part, we know that the vaccines that are currently available on the market are only available because they've received emergency use authorization by the Food and Drug Administration. And that EUA from the FDA, so the emergency use authorization, includes very specific information about notice that must be provided to individuals who are receiving the vaccine, and the fact that it must be in a knowing setting with the employee understanding all of the risks related to the vaccine itself. And forcing somebody to do something that the EUA says that you specifically can't force or mandate someone to do leaves a lot of questions up in the air. So it may be that as an organization, until the vaccine has gone through all FDA approvals and is no longer in this emergency use authorization stage, that you want to wait before you mandate any policy. Jackie, let's jump to the next slide. When we're talking about policy considerations, one of the first steps we're going to talk about is unionization concerns. And this is twofold. One, for the organizations that are already unionized, and then the second step is being, if you're in a non-unionized environment, things that you need to keep at top of mind. For organizations that are already unionized, the question becomes is mandating the vaccine a mandatory or a permissive subject? In most situations, within a collective bargaining agreement, a mandatory subject is wages, hours, and other terms and conditions of employment. If it's a mandatory subject, in most situations, the employer is going to have to bargain with the union before they can implement that change. So for a unionized work environment, you cannot, in most situations, depending on your CBA, simply implement a mandatory vaccine policy. Instead, you're going to have to negotiate that with the union and make sure that both parties are coming to the table. There's been some discussion about, well, how could we potentially get around this? And could we get around it by requiring applicants who come to us to be vaccinated and have been vaccinated? Maybe, but the question then becomes is what good is that doing to your organization that you are kind of mandating that your new employees be vaccinated, and maybe that is a requirement of a job, but that it's not a requirement of the job for individuals who previously were employed. you're going to run into just general issues about the credibility of that policy and how it's directly related to the job duties and responsibilities, and how someone would pose a direct threat if they were an applicant who wasn't immunized and therefore didn't get the job. So you'd run into that issue. For your non-unionized work environment, what we're seeing a lot more of is the question of culture. How is your team going to respond to the mandated requirement? And this is with regards to the mandated requirement, or other ways in which organizations have moved forward with this is strongly suggesting, or we're going to talk about incentivizing. Understanding how your team's going to respond is important, because if you mandate immunization, if you mandate the vaccination, you likely are going to start hearing rumbling with people being upset about terms and conditions of employment. We know that discussions and rumbling about terms and conditions is protected conduct. And that's when you start having unionization efforts in which employees feel as though their voices aren't being heard, and they're going to, attempt to unionize in the hopes of having their voice heard. Let's jump to the next slide, Jackie. So let's talk about incentives, which is something that many of you, I'm sure, have heard a lot about. A month ago, a large group of employers throughout the country sent a letter to the EEOC. And this letter was signed by more than 40 business groups. And what it did was it requested that the EEOC provide clarity as it relates to legal uncertainty concerning providing vaccine incentives. Many of you have likely heard in the news, or may even be employed by employers who are offering some type of incentive. We've seen Texas's largest hospital system offered what they referred to as a $500 hope bonus that was directly tied to individuals who received inoculation against COVID-19. This was 2,600 workers. We've seen organizations that are offering $100 incentive bonuses. We've seen some who are offering 4 hours of pay to individuals who are receiving the vaccine. Now, in a lot of these cases, employers are treating this within the terms of their wellness program. Now, in the change of administration, we've also seen some changes in the rules regarding employee incentives as it relates to wellness plans and the wellness rules. So on January 7th, the EEOC provided updated proposed wellness rules for review. Now, January 7th, this was under the Trump administration. As soon as President Biden took office, those were suspended, and the EEOC has since withdrawn that guidance. Now, the proposed rules regarding incentive provided that you could provide de minimis incentives, which would be considered stuff such as like water bottles or a gift card of modest value. That proposed rule has now, however, been first suspended and now withdrawn. This leaves employers kind of unsure of how to proceed. The last discussion or the rules that previously were in effect regarding company-sponsored wellness plans had been struck down by a federal judge, which is what led to kind of this discussion regarding different types of incentives. A lot of employers will say that they're willing to take the risk right now because they believe that having vaccinated employees on site is more important than kind of the unknown regarding the EEOC rules on this or how it will be treated kind of generally. Unfortunately, it was my hope that as Jackie and I were planning this webinar, that we'd have an answer from the EEOC, providing some clarity to employers as to what would be considered de minimis, and how individuals could include it within a voluntary wellness program. We don't have that clarity yet. The arguments that have been made as to why it's inappropriate is the higher the incentive or the richer the incentive, the easier it's going to be to argue that the incentive was coercive, that the individual didn't really have a choice as to whether to accept the incentive because it was so rich. The next question becomes, what happens if you are an employee who can't be vaccinated because of a religious belief or because of some type of disability related issue? In those situations, if they did not receive the incentive, that potentially could be religious or disability related discrimination or retaliation. So being mindful that exceptions may need to be made and these incentives provided to employees, even if they don't meet the definition or requirement of receiving the vaccine. The other aspect of it is depending on how you categorize or what type of incentive you provide, it could have effects on wage and hour laws. Is a discretionary bonus, those type of things will play a role in determining overtime. If you're paying for extra hours that it might take to receive the vaccine, are those considered work hours? Are they PTO hours? How you treat the time away, either receiving the vaccine or whether or not you relate it to hours worked, will have effects from a wage and hour perspective as to how you pay employees. Let's go to the next slide, Jackie. So kind of going in from that last discussion about wage and hour laws, the question of if you mandate it and if it is mandated, when it's provided or how it's paid for, then leaves people scratching their head about whether or not workers' compensation concerns kind of enter the picture. Now, we know that workers' compensation is most likely going to kick in if a situation or health condition or an injury arises out of or in the course of employment. So questions concerning when the vaccine was taken, whether or not the individual was on the clock, whether or not the vaccine was mandated by an employer, strongly suggested by an employer. All of these are big questions that are going to be asked in determining whether or not workers' compensation potentially could come into effect for employees who experience adverse side effects from any COVID vaccine. Now, I don't think we're seeing a ton of issues related to those side effects, but we are seeing some, and more so, I think the science is showing from the second course of the vaccine. But keeping in mind that where the shot occurs, if it's on site with the employer, if it's during work time, if the individual is being paid, if it's mandated or not mandated, all of those are questions that are going to be asked in determining whether or not workers' compensation is going to cover any injury related to receipt of the COVID vaccine. Now, it's important that employers, however, refrain from any discussion or offering guidance or support to employees about whether or not workers' compensation is going to cover any such injury. As you all know, whether workers' comp covers the injury is not a determination that's made by the employer, but instead it is going to be a state agency question. If an individual doesn't have access to or is covered by the workers' compensation process or program, The individual would then have to file claims for any adverse reaction or injury that they experience as a result of the vaccine with the federal countermeasures injury compensation program. And they do that because the pandemic has been declared a public emergency. So it would use that program as opposed to the federal program that normally is used for vaccine-related illness claims. Now, have we found ourselves in a situation like this in the past, and what's the standard? Not really. I mean, we have precedent from the smallpox vaccine, but those were 1930 requirements. So we have a handful of experts who have specialized their practice in kind of that smallpox vaccine requirement as it relates to workers' compensation. But to say we have a standard, I think, is an overstatement. The big thing to keep in mind, however, is that states are generally going to err on the side of protecting employers from liability or covering an employee's injury is another way to say that. So keeping that in mind, if you are mandating the vaccine, considering all the other risks that we're going to discuss, that workers' compensation may play a role in any injury that may be experienced by an employee as a result of that vaccine. Jackie, let's jump to the next slide. So the discussion that we hear the most about, and the agency that's been providing us with the most guidance, of course, is the EEOC. And as many of you are aware, the EEOC covers statutes such as the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Rehabilitation Act, Genetic Information Non-Disclosure Act, also known as GINA, and then Title VII regarding discrimination. Now, the EEOC has been good at providing updated guidance, but at the same time, taking that guidance as it relates to your organization and the direct threat analysis makes it more difficult. The EEOC has stated that an employer can mandate employees be vaccinated, but in order to make that mandate, there's going to be exceptions and an analysis, a very specific analysis that the employer is going to have to maintain, with the understanding that accommodations will have to be made in certain circumstances. The EEOC, however, also focuses in on certain aspects of it. And we talked about it a little bit earlier, but there's this big concern with pre-screening tests. The vaccine and receipt of the vaccine itself is not a medical examination, but if the employer is the one who's administering the vaccine, then in order to ask any questions before you give the vaccine, those questions are going to become a medical screening. And an employer can only provide a medical screening to an employee under the ADA if it's job related and consistent with business necessity, right? So before you even get to that point, you're going to have to say, for us to ask the pre-screening questions, are the questions we're asking job related and consistent with business necessity? And in doing that, we then have to determine if an employee, in answering the questions, refuses to be vaccinated, will that individual pose a direct threat to the health or safety of themselves or others by refusing to receive the vaccine? So while you can say, here's the vaccine, we're mandating it, right? And here are the pre-screening questions, that's going to open the door to the ADA discussion. So other organizations have said, well, okay, I'm not going to require immunization occur on site. I'm not going to provide the immunizations. And specifically, if you're not a healthcare provider, you likely don't have access or the ability to do that anyways. But can I require proof of immunization? So either for my current employees or for applicants, can I require it? This is that horrible attorney answer that I know everyone hates, and I make jokes about it, but the answer is yes, you can require proof of immunization, But there becomes questions regarding what happens when the answer is no, I don't have proof of immunization, or no, I'm not immunized. Because in a normal circumstance, when you say we require proof of immunization, please provide proof, the individual is going to say no, I don't have proof of immunization because, and they're going to provide you with a reason. It might be, I don't believe in vaccines, I have a disability, I have a religious reason, but you're going to oftentimes receive additional information that in and of itself is going to be protected, which means that you have to be ready if you're going to have further discussions to prove that your need for that record of immunization was job related and consistent with business necessity. So if you're able to just ask, I mean, if you're just asking and you're not going to restrict someone from coming to work or working for you, whether they have it or not, maybe it would then be safe to have or request proof of immunization. But as you'll see on the slide, if you're requiring it, then you're likely going to run into issues. What if, so then let's say you've required the immunization, or you're providing immunization on site and going through the pre-screening process because you've shown that it's business related, it's a job necessity and business related. What happens when somebody says, I will not become vaccinated because of my religious beliefs or because of a disability? At that point in time, we find ourselves in the reasonable accommodation dialogue that we normally would participate in with any employee who is requesting a reasonable accommodation. In this situation, however, the question becomes, if that unvaccinated person is on site or working with you, would they pose a direct threat due to significant risk of substantial harm to the health or safety of that person or others, and that harm can't be eliminated through use of a reasonable accommodation? Now, currently, that is a hard standard to meet because we currently have a host of people walking around the world right now who don't have access to the immunization or the vaccine. And in those situations, we're using other alternative ways to stop the spread or decrease the spread through masking, through hand washing, through social distancing. You're also going to have discussions. I mean, simply refusing the vaccine doesn't mean that a termination is then the only option. You're going to then have to discuss all of those social distancing, whether or not somebody can work remotely. At this point in time, when so many organizations still have a number of people working remotely, it's going to be more and more difficult to tell someone that they must be excluded from the work environment generally because of their refusal to take the mandated vaccine, because we still have so many people who are working remotely within an organization or who have been working and are unvaccinated because they don't have access to the vaccine. Questions regarding GINA are less likely to occur unless you're working in an environment in which your pre-screening questions are asking about the health conditions of a fetus or about family member health conditions. So if you're requesting information about an individual's genetic tests, about information about genetic tests of an employee's family members, or information about the manifestation of any disease or disorder, if you're asking any of those questions in your pre-screening questions, then you likely are going to have a GINA issue or concern. But if those aren't within any of your pre-screening questions, then you're less likely to have GINA violation issues. Let's jump to the next slide, Jackie. And Let's talk about political beliefs. I mean, we talked just a little bit about religious beliefs and indicating that your religion will not permit you to become vaccinated, and recall that it's not an employer or HR's position to question different religious beliefs, but if it's a sincerely held religious belief of the individual, that in and of itself is sufficient for us to then, have that accommodation dialogue to determine whether or not we can make a reasonable accommodation. Additionally, though, what happens if it's not a religious reason, but it's more of a political belief? In the last few years, we've seen a growing number of individuals who identify themselves as quote unquote anti-vaxxers, that either they don't believe, and I'm going to use believe very strongly, not from a religious standpoint, but just from either science or other basis standpoint in vaccines, or they're part of this anti-vax movement that can be considered a political belief. In those situations, you need to be really mindful that although the EEOC isn't going to directly come into play, there's state laws that will or may come into effect depending on where you're located. California and New York specifically have statutes that indicate that you can't take action against an employee for outside political activities. When this comes into the work environment, what's the effect there? I mean, it's also outside, so that creates some interesting questions. Also, you need to review state laws, even if you don't have an outside political activities statute. There's oftentimes public policy exceptions regarding termination of employment or adverse action within the work environment. So if you operate in a state that has a public policy exception, you're going to want to be mindful of the parameters that are set forth there. The other thing is this opens up another can of worms if you have a mandatory policy, because if you have a mandatory policy and someone's refusing to comply with it or refuses to become vaccinated, naturally the next question of most employers is going to be why. And then they're going to determine how to move forward. If it's a health condition, are there accommodations that are necessary? If it's religious, how do we move forward from there? Would the individual still be a direct threat? Or would accommodating this individual result in kind of a de minimis change? But then from a state law perspective, are you in a place in which public policy would dictate that no adverse action could be taken? Or could an argument be made that this falls within a political belief statute? Let's go to the next slide, Jackie. What about for the people, we've been focusing a lot on the people who refuse mandatory vaccines, but let's talk about the individuals who already are vaccinated or who choose to get vaccinated. Remember that the vaccination and the individuals who are vaccinated, that's personal health information. So employers can't disclose individuals who have been inoculated or have received the vaccine. Currently, one of those aspects, and that goes with the science that we discussed earlier, is you need to continue to follow the science. You need to continue to follow what the CDC is saying. So even if someone's been vaccinated, you still need to maintain your masking policies, because we are unclear. It's unclear whether or not the spread can still occur from individuals who have been vaccinated. We still need to maintain social distancing policies. We still need to continue with any increased cleaning regimens that we had in place. Any policies that we create regarding individuals who have been vaccinated or unvaccinated, it all needs to be grounded in science. So I don't recommend having different policies for people based off of these individuals have been vaccinated, these rules apply to these individuals haven't been vaccinated, so these different rules apply. We don't have enough information yet in order to truly create policies that are grounded in science and fact that will withstand scrutiny when they are challenged by individuals based off of lack of receipt of the vaccination as a result of disability, political belief, religious belief, all of those. Make sure that you're not sharing information or data about people who have been vaccinated or not vaccinated that could violate their privacy rights. This includes stuff such as identifying badges or buttons such as "I've voted" or "I've been vaccinated." These individuals should still be wearing face coverings. They shouldn't have any identifying buttons, pins, face masks that indicated their vaccination status. In fact, really the only change in policy right now that the CDC has said would be permissible would be that the quarantine policy. So for employers who require some form of quarantine, if they've come in contact with someone who is suspected or confirmed as to having COVID-19, that those individuals wouldn't have to quarantine if they can meet all three of the following criteria, which is: one, they aren't showing COVID-19 symptoms; two, it's been at least 2 weeks since they completed their 2 or now 1-dose series of vaccinations; and then finally, the last dose of the vaccine was in the past 3 months. So really changing the quarantine policy is the only thing that you can do differently for those who have been vaccinated versus those who are not vaccinated. So that's also important to keep in mind. I know that the last 48 minutes have included a ton of information. Jackie, let's go to that next slide so that we can give everyone a break. I am now going to turn over to the Q&A portion of the discussion. We're going to try to stay right at the 1 hour mark. And I am going to start going through different questions. So the first question is, what am I seeing companies do with their sales team regarding travel restrictions, policies, and the like? Specifically, I've seen companies that are reviewing different state rules with regards to travel restrictions that may still be in place. And depending on how those state rules set forth quarantine requirements, whether that state is allowing or has individuals who have access to the vaccine who have been vaccinated, but in most cases, really still following the state procedures and requirements, limiting the travel as much as possible, attempting to do as much remotely as possible still for the safety of those individuals and then the public more generally. I think as we start to see more and more states decreasing the regulations, that we'll see kind of more or increased travel. This whole time, however, recall that you're going to still be faced with individuals who have compromised immune systems, who are potentially going to be advised that they shouldn't be traveling or otherwise kind of engaging in public travel or large group environments. So you're going to want to keep in mind that even if you are in a state or you operate in locations in which it's safe for travel and there's no isolation or quarantine requirement upon return, that in those situations you still may have people who are being advised by doctors that they shouldn't be traveling. The next question I have is it legal to require that employees let us know whether they've been vaccinated? So, and that one came up, that was an early question that did come up during the course of the presentation. So it is, I mean, you can require that employers provide you with notice if they have been vaccinated. It's really the follow-up questions that could come out of it that then may be seen as a medical screening, which you're going to then have to maintain or show that it's job related and subject to business necessity. The next question is, if one portion of our workforce is unionized and the other is not, can we require the non-unionized to have the vaccine and then work separately with the union to advocate for mandatory vaccination? Yes. The question though becomes is when individuals who are within the non-unionized portion of your work, well, I'm going to say yes, with the caveat that without seeing the CBA or who it like, there's a lot to that, but based only on the information that's been provided in this question, the answer is yes, you could mandate that your non-unionized individuals or workforce receive the vaccine. The question though becomes is for those who refuse the mandate, talking about how it's subject to business necessity when you have half of a workforce that has not been vaccinated. So I would recommend, or I think in this situation, I would wait to mandate the vaccination of the non-unionized workforce until you've been able to negotiate with the unionized workforce, and then at the same time require that all team members be vaccinated, and then move forward with all the exceptions that you potentially are going to have to make within the organization. With starting out as you're doing those negotiations, kind of generally strongly recommending to employees and educating employees as to why the vaccination is helpful in operations and in reopening, travel, the economy, all these other aspects that are set forth specifically on the CDC website. The next question. Oh, and so it says in response to the last slide, and I'm unclear which one that is, so I might not be able to answer this. There wasn't an answer as to whether employers can give an incentive for staff getting the vaccine. It sounds as though there is no guidance. Is that the case? We can take the risk if we want to. That's correct. So the EEOC has not come down with guidance. So there's risks associated with providing incentives. And then if you do provide incentives, are you going to have exceptions for those who can't be vaccinated because of religious or disability related kind of reasons? So the question is, and this is what a lot of organizations are weighing, is the risks associated with claims of discrimination or violation of wellness plans or statements that our incentives were coercive in nature because they were so incentivizing, does that violate the law? And the big thing becomes is if you're incentivizing with a can koozie or a water bottle, do employees really see that as an incentive? If you're incentivizing with $500 or 3 paid days of vacation, that's more easily, you can see that it's an incentive, but the larger the incentive, the stronger the argument is that the policy was coercive and it didn't provide employees with a choice as to whether or not to receive the vaccine. The next question is, can you elaborate on the workers' comp slide? It sounds like individuals can get involved, but what constitutes them getting involved? So that's going again to become a question as to, did you mandate the vaccine? Was the vaccine given on site? Were you paying for employees' times when they received the vaccine? All of those elements are going to be looked at or taken into consideration when, and depending on your state, whether or not the injury arises out of or in the course of employment, which is the standard that's going to be instituted. The next question is is there any issue in asking employees to voluntarily tell the employer if they have received the vaccination, including voluntarily providing written proof? Depending on kind of that voluntary nature of it, yes. Is it seen as coercive? How is it communicated to the staff? Did the staff feel as though it was in a public setting in which they would be publicly shamed if they said yes or no? The vaccination information itself, depending on what's included in the proof, if it's just a card that says that the vaccination occurred and on what date and they received Moderna or Pfizer, whichever type, that's not going to be a medical inquiry in and of itself. It's the follow-up questions that become more concerning there. And then the question, you can say voluntary, but it's going to be looking at all the facts and circumstances to determine whether or not it truly was voluntary. The next question is, if an employee is client-facing, can the employer require that they get a vaccine because a reasonable accommodation to work from home cannot be permanent for maximum success in their role, especially if there are travel expectations? This becomes a science question, and I don't want anyone to think that I'm attempting to be a scientist or a medical professional in any way, but the current data and information would indicate that even if you've been vaccinated, you can still spread, you can still obtain COVID and spread COVID. It's just that your symptoms, either you'll be asymptomatic or your symptoms will be lessened. So it becomes a harder kind of question, it becomes a harder argument to make with those factors, that it's subject to business necessity, and that's the only way for someone not to pose a direct threat to the safety or health of others. Because we have masking, we have social distancing, we have extra hand washing and cleaning regimens that could provide similar I don't want to say standards, but foreclose the spread in a similar way. So the question becomes, is this individual not receiving symptoms? How does that play a role in your everyday operations? So I think that question, we need more information, and that right now it's a hard argument depending on your industry, unless you're able to show, subject to business necessity and that whole standard, and then that there is a direct threat if this individual doesn't receive the vaccine. Jackie, do you think time for one more, or where do you think we're at right now?
Yeah, I think we have time for one more, and then we'll send everyone on their way.
Okay. We have a lot of questions, so a question, this one's, can you fire an employee due to religious beliefs if that person does not want to get the vaccine? I mean, you're going to have the full discussion about whether or not that individual is going to pose a direct threat to your workforce based off of their refusal to become vaccinated. So that's when you're going to do that full discussion of each of the direct threat standards that are currently in place. So the duration of the risk, the nature and severity of the potential harm, the likelihood that the potential harm will occur, and the imminence of the potential harm. So if an individual refuses vaccination based off of a religious belief, if you can prove that they maintain a direct threat and there's no way you can minimize that direct threat, and that's under federal law, then yes, you potentially could. I think it's a very, very high risk maneuver. And depending on your workforce, the type of industry you're in, the position itself, I think there's going to be limited situations where you can do it. But the short answer would be yes, but there are a ton of exceptions to that yes.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for all of your questions. I want to thank you, Tawny, for presenting today. It's always great partnering with you guys. I want to thank everyone again for attending this webinar. We hope that you came away with some helpful information as we all try to navigate this situation. If you have any questions for Tawny, her contact information is in the presentation. If you've been on any of our recent webinars, you know that MP is currently offering services to help businesses claim employee retention credits and maximize their PPP funds. If you would like to learn more about how MP can help with these topics and more, you can email us at marketing@mp-hr.com or schedule a call with us via the follow-up email. We hope that you all stay healthy and have a great day. Thank you so much.